Okay, inshallah, we'll start now. I'm just gonna give a quick introduction. So the speaker for today is Brother Uthman. So he's a writer, activist, and a student of a variety of academic disciplines. He studied Arabic and Islamic sciences, and he's a PhD candidate in contextual philosophy in the University of Western Sydney. So basically, he's given political activism for over a decade, and has engaged in many important topics that are actually big threats to Islam today, like such as liberalism, secularism, and how secular governments in Islamic worlds and all of that. So inshallah, with that in mind, and with such a knowledgeable speaker, we'll start today and tackle this massive issue that's fallen to the Muslim Ummah. So, Brother Uthman, you can start now if you want. Jazakallah khair.
جزاك الله خيرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I'm assuming everyone can hear me at this point. Okay, so first of all, just sort of the way we want to operate here. As the brother said, feel free to type something in or even use the mic. I encourage people to use the mic to ask a question at any time. However, there's just one issue now that I think, because I'm sharing screen, I can't see the chat. Let me see if I can change that. I can see all the participants, but yes, okay, that's going to be an issue. All right, so what I'll do, I guess in that case, is I might, from time to time, stop sharing the screen to see if there's any comments. Or maybe one of the organizers, maybe Junaid, maybe you can alert me to any comments.
Yeah.
Okay? Because I can't...
Yeah, I can stop you. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, just
use the mic and read out the questions.
Yeah. And anyone else, if you can also use the mic, but I appreciate that some people might not want to use the mic or might not want to show their videos as well. Otherwise, in Origin, if you are comfortable sharing your video, please do that. I know because the subject that I taught at uni this semester obviously went online after all the COVID stuff, and it was very difficult to get students to share their videos. I think they're very comfortable in just not having to do the preparations to look presentable, I guess. So anyway, that's fine. But yeah, I've got a few slides that I'm just going to use as a pointers to speak to. But we've tested this out, and I'm assuming everyone can see the video and hear the audio and also see the slides at the same time. And you've got the option of making the slides or the video bigger or smaller from your end. Yeah, other than that, obviously it's not the same as meeting in person. It would have been great to have, the event at UNSW itself. It's a lot more intimate and therefore easier for conducive to learning and understanding. But we'll do what we can with this, right? But it needs to be a two-way thing. So feel free to intervene at any time with a question or a comment, or if I drop out or something as well. Otherwise, the plan that I have is, okay, first of all, in terms of the time, 2 hours is the time we have. It's quite a bit, but hopefully that gives us some time to look at some of these issues in depth, inshallah. I'm going to be the full last half hour, maybe even 40 minutes for Q&A. At the same time, I don't want to talk for an hour and a half and then have Q&A. I'll try and stop at 2 or 3 points, even within the presentation, to just stop for Q&A, right? And even apart from that, if you have a question at any point, anyone has a question, then do butt in at any point, inshallah. Otherwise, the broad plan I have is as follows, the outline. Excuse me. Also, I apologize for the screen. The video quality is not the best using the laptop, which is a uni laptop, and it hasn't got the best resolution, I guess. So the rough outline, what I want to do is I want to spend some time in understanding liberalism. Okay, so the topic is a critique of liberal morality, which is basically our dominant form of secular morality these days, and has been the case for a long time now. So we want to understand what liberalism is. Obviously, if you're talking about liberal morality, then you're talking about liberalism. So we want to have a bit, we want to try and get a better understanding of what liberalism is, and then look at what secular moral frameworks are, some of the differences, some of the different types, and then eventually get to a comparative between Islamic morality and these secular moral frameworks. Part of which, when I say secular is a bit broader than liberal, as we'll see, but within the broader sort of set of secular moral frameworks, you have liberal moral frameworks that we want to focus on a bit more particularly. And then I'll end up with the specific points of how we can critique liberal morality. Now, all of this, I'm cognizant, it's a discussion within the context of Dawah, and more specifically in the context of Dawah uni, right? And so I'm going to try and speak at that sort of level, try and mostly avoid too much technical academic terminology, try and focus on understanding, although they'll be there on my slide. I've kept them there, but when I explain things, I'll try and make it as simple as possible. And but yeah, the point is, it's in a Dawah context, so this is where I guess you guys come in. I want to also, I've already read some of the questions that were put up before. I'll try to address them as we go along. But at the same time, the specific type of questions that you guys are getting on campus, if you bring them up within the context of the discussion, then that makes it a lot more practical and a lot more beneficial, right? But the premise of this is basically we need to understand what we're critiquing well in order to arrive at the proper critique, and that will allow us to do better dawah, right? That will give us the confidence, because knowledge brings confidence, to know who we're speaking to, what their background is. Right? It's like anything else. If I'm speaking to someone, I don't know anything about them, it's going to be a difficult conversation, right? And I'm going to have to ask the questions and whatnot, which is good anyway, it's not a problem. But if I know at least about their ideological background, some of the debates, some of the differences, then I'm in a more confident position to diagnose the issue, right? And then speak to it. And more or less in a uni context, and generally in a secular liberal society like ours, you will find these sort of moral frameworks are what people are referencing when they both make claims of their own, right? So like, human rights, United Nations, and we're going to Iraq because, there's contraventions of human rights and whatnot. And when they critique or criticize other people, such as us, Muslims, and Islam, again, they are referencing their own moral framework. Sometimes they know that, sometimes they don't know that, right? And that's where you come in to show them that. And in fact, one of the most powerful techniques of dawah is to be able to show someone where they're coming from, right? To explicate, to make explicit for them their own assumptions, their own principles, and their own presuppositions. And that allows for a much better discussion to take place. So that's what I want to try and do, spend some time understanding liberalism, which is in terms of its historical development, in terms of what it is, in terms of some of the gaps between the theory and the practice, and maybe also a little bit about what it's contrasted to, because one way to understand anything is by looking at its contrast, what it's contrasted to, right? And then we'll move forward as per this outline, inshallah ta'ala. Yeah. All right. I'm just minimizing this. Finger. Oh, that's better. Okay, so when we talk about liberalism, it's not simple to define in like one or two lines. It's got multiple aspects to it, which like most ideologies, it's just that ideologies are things which start somewhere and they develop over time and over decades and centuries, and then they develop and move and change. And so it can be difficult to do that. But we can define it by looking at some of the different aspects. So liberalism is a modern means, post 15th, 16th century. Post-Reformation, the Reformation is a particular event in Europe which was extremely significant because it led to the breakdown of Christendom, right? So prior to, prior to what's referred to as modernity, the modern period, we have pre-modern times, we have the medieval ages that are dominated by Christianity and Christendom. I want to say Christendom, that's more of a, Christianity and politics are one. You have the Pope, he has political power as well. You have emperors, right? So it's a very different setup. Feudalism is the order of the day. And the Reformation specifically is it's a split within Christianity, which gives rise to Protestantism, right, as against the previously dominant Catholicism, right? So liberalism is a post-Reformation. It's one of the things that arises in the wake of this split and this breakdown of Christianity, basically because they needed an alternative. They needed to find something new. Lots of things were happening, as we'll see, in Europe at this time, which led to the rise of liberalism. It's a secular ideology, which basically means it tries to organize society and life. It tries to organize society and life away from any reference to God or revelation, right? And it's an anthropocentric ideology. What that means, anthropo means human in Greek. And so it's a human-centric ideology, basically trying to decenter God, Allah Ta'ala, and center the human being and build and organize society around the human being, right? Beyond that, liberalism emphasizes human equality and freedom from all forms of external authority, right? And again, this needs to be broken down. I'll speak about some of these important aspects in part, but this is one way in which you can understand it. At least this is one way in which liberals themselves try to get their way of life, that it's about human equality, humans as equal and free, and freedom from all forms of external authority. External authority like the church, like the state, the government, but of course you have to have a state, and that leads to a bit of a conflict, which we'll talk about. But generally, now, specifically in that, what's very important in understanding liberalism and understanding secularism, modernity, is that in particular, when they talk about external authority, it's in particular referencing the authority of God, because that was the historical reality. That was what they were moving away from, right? So you had a God-centered form of life in their way. There was a problem that it was oppressive, but that was their vision, Europe's version. And the liberal and the secular push is away from that. So when they say freedom from external authority, in particular, not exclusively, but that in particular includes away from the authority of Allah, obviously also known as kufr, right? So this is part of why it's such an antithetical ideology to Islam, right, for this reason. And this is important. People don't understand this. People, if you don't look at it this way, if you just say, oh, this is about human equality and freedom, that sounds nice, right? But as always, the devil's in the detail, and we need to understand things in this matter. You can obviously get to this. It's not something that others are imposing on it. It's very simple to ask, okay, when you say freedom, what do you mean freedom from what, right? And you can understand it in that sense, but you can also understand it in the very clear historical evolution of these ideologies. Now, that's the theory of it, right? There's also a wedge or a gap between the theory and the practice. In practice, liberalism has presided over a very imperial, colonial, going out and basically exploiting other nations in a way that's not very, equal or freedom-ish, about freedom. Imperialistic, Eurocentric, very, very focused on European ways of doing things, a way of organizing societies. It's based on ideological conceptions of freedom and equality. What that means is, it's one thing to say, we're about freedom, we're about equality, but what does that mean, right? In fact, I'd say most people won't have an issue with the idea of freedom itself, but the point is, there's no such thing as a freestanding, neutral non-ideological concept of freedom, right? Or equality. Like, what do you mean by equality? What do you mean by freedom, right? So they are the ideological conceptions of freedom and equality. However, they are posited, they are projected as being neutral, natural, and universal, right? Neutral, as in they don't refer to any ideology, any comprehensive doctrine. Natural, as in there's just self-evident, right? So, you know, like all human beings have human rights, and that's just a natural fact, right? But it's not a natural fact, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Universal, they apply for everyone and everywhere, right? So really, it's a very particular cultural way of life, but it's projected as being natural and universal. Are there any questions at this point? Just on this, maybe we can go slide by slide as well, because only about 10, 11 slides. Are there any questions at this point? Are there any questions in the chat? Am I making sense? Is it okay? Right? Otherwise, I'm just talking to myself.
Yeah, no one's asked any questions, but I got a question. I think you're probably gonna go into it, but what do you mean by, you know, all humans are not capable of having natural rights? Because we learned that, you know, in the schools and stuff.
Yeah, so we'll look at that when we come to human rights. That's a good question. That's a very good question, because they do claim that human rights are universal and inalienable and whatnot.
Yes. Right.
But it's about understanding exactly what they mean, right? Because obviously there's a content of them. Okay, so what rights does everyone have? Okay, you have the right to life. You have the right to freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. Like, there's going to be a list, right? And so the point is, as soon as you open up the list, you start seeing the cultural valence or the cultural aspect, the ideological aspect of it, right? So for a very simple example, now, as opposed to before, and the list changes as well over time, which is not a problem for them, right? But from our perspective, that's a bit how's it going. For example, now, from some time, your inalienable universal human right includes a right to sexuality. You can choose whatever type of sexuality you do, right? And obviously, Muslims won't. Muslims, even Christians, some Christians, some Jews don't believe that, right? Because they're coming from a different, very different way of understanding morality, as we'll see. So, anyway, with a very good question, we'll come to it. But that's good. Any question, even if you think it's not relevant right now, ask it so that it's there, and then we'll try and address it at the relevant point. So, in terms of the historical development as well, so that's sort of, the first slide was sort of a brief overview of the different aspects, different sort of markers of liberalism that would help us understand it. Historical development also helps us understand it, which is true with anything. How does something historically arise, and how does it historically develop? In what conditions, in what concrete material contexts does it develop, right? Liberalism develops alongside a number of other very significant modern formations. The modern state, capitalism, secularism, right? The disintegration of Christianity, and there's a number of other things. But these three have unique significance, right? So when I say the modern state is a state which has very extensive, very comprehensive, and very thoroughgoing authority to an unprecedented degree, right? And very centralized authority to an unprecedented degree, right? So it's a much more, in simple terms, a much more powerful state, much more, it's a state that has a lot more control over the societies in which they have authority, right? As compared to pre-modern states, right? Where, for example, you know, like European empires, you have the emperor is in Rome, for instance, for the Western Roman Empire. But what sort of authority can he exercise in, you know, North Africa when that was part of the Roman Empire? He can only exercise a very generic authority there. So what that ends up doing is the people over there, the governors over there have actual authority, and the emperor only has very symbolic authority. That this was also the case with many of the caliphates, many of the khilafas throughout Islamic history. The Khalifa, for example, the Abbasi Khalifa is in Baghdad. In theory, his authority, and in practice to some extent, extends, way beyond that. But in these other places, in North Africa, even in some parts of Europe, in different parts of the Middle East, right, in the subcontinent, it's the governors that actually exercise authority. And even in the governors, like in a particular area, the governor's reach only goes so far, right? Purely because of technological and communication limitations, right? I think there's a couple of questions in the chat, so I can see it. I think,
okay, you can see the. Can you see the chat?
Yeah, I think so. I just figured. I think what happens is it starts flashing. Let me see, but I can't seem to go to it.
Oh, it's fine. I can read it out.
Okay. Yeah, can you read it out?
Yeah. Okay. So it was actually in regards to the previous slide. The question was wondering if these secular ideas initially started with privileging a constitutional monarchy over the divine rights of kings.
Yeah.
And in brackets, it's like, I know this is heavily informed Locke's writing, but I'm not sure if it was the very beginning.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, and it's in part it's true. Although there's different theories about the exact what starts and what it moves to and whatnot. It's very difficult to come up with a very accurate or definitive chronology in that sense, right? But therefore it's easier to talk about broad movements. But it's true. One of the things that happened was that we've gone from emperors who claimed to have a divine right to rule to constitutional monarchies, and then eventually to constitutional democracies, right? So there's been movements over time, and that is an aspect of them. Oh, here we go. All right, I can see it now.
Cool.
Right. Okay, that's fine. Let me see if I can. So I'm just checking this again. Where is it? Yeah, okay. If I click on chat, it comes up. All right. So modern state, rise of capitalism, capitalism as a market-based economics, and much more centrally and structurally market-based economics. And then later, in the 20th century, we get a market-based societies, right, which is referred to as neoliberalism. That's very late in the piece, 1970s, 60s onwards. But when we say market-based, that's what's a simple way of explaining that? So think about university, right? University provides education, right? Higher education. Education is a public good. It's a public item of consumption, right? How do we distribute education? That's the question. One way to do it is to do it through the market. How do you do it through the market? You give it a price. You say, this is the price. Whoever has the money and wants to buy it can buy it. If you don't, well, bad luck, right? And so the price is actually a way of distributing goods, right? And obviously with sort of your normal everyday consumer goods, it's very much understandable. But neoliberalism goes to the extent where pretty much everything in society is now decided by the market, right? But going back to where we're still in the 16th, 17th century, 18th century, we didn't have neoliberalism, but we had the start of capitalism, very strong market-based system, and liberalism was working in tandem with this, right? And there's obviously a dialectic relationship two ways, where the form that capitalism takes depends on liberalism and vice versa as well. We also have the development of secularism, which can be argued to be prior, right? And that means questions arise about what comes first. What influences what? Does secularism give rise to liberalism or the other way around? Does liberalism give rise to capitalism or the other way around? And what you'll find in the literature and academic scholars, you'll get different theories, right? So therefore, for our purposes today, it's not really important. It's easier to just understand this as different aspects of what's happening and what they are and some of their influence. So secularism here is another way of looking at that centering of the human being and the decentering of God, right? And secularism generally is understood as the separation of church and state, separation of religion from politics, but it's more than that. It's actually the creation of the modern concept of religion, right? Like prior to modernity, we don't have the modern concept of religion, which is basically a private faith distinct from politics and from societal affairs, right? So that's a subtle point, but it's important to understand. It's like you'll get people come to you and say, why is Islam so political, right? And for them, it's a meaningful question. You can receive that and think, what sort of question is that, right? Whereas for them, it's a meaningful and logical question. Why? Because they understand religion per se. They understand the very concept of religion in a certain way. It's meant to be a private faith. It informs your private morality and teaches you some ethics, and you have some, to them, weird and outdated beliefs about the hereafter and about God and angels and whatnot, right? And it's supposed to be away from politics because it's private. That's why for them it makes sense, and they ask you that question. This is a very good example of where you, instead of just answering it directly, you need to step back and interrogate their very understanding of religion, right? Because they've got an understanding of religion, and they understand Islam to be a subset of religion, and therefore they're asking you this question or critiquing you on that basis. But modernity and modern secularism actually gives rise to this understanding of religion, and basically in trying to privatize and marginalize it to the private realm. Not that he ever fully succeeds in doing that, but nevertheless there is an attempt, maybe not to fully privatize, but to marginalize, to hierarchize, to put it in a hierarchy where what's most important is what people decide in their politics, in their parliaments, and in theory, in their deliberation, right? Now, there is also a historical chronology here. Liberalism, in terms of the time frames, liberalism takes shape in the 16th and 17th century Europe. It consolidates in 18th and 19th centuries in multiple regions around the world, so it's exported primarily by the barrel of the gun through colonialism, which again, straight away it shows up some of its very obvious deficiencies. Like on the one hand, you're saying it's about freedom and equality. On the other hand, you're spreading it through colonialism, which is a very brutal form of expansion and exploitation of other peoples, right? And we'll see some of why that's the case a bit later. And then by the 20th century, it really dominates political discourse all over the world, right? Not necessarily universally, but in most parts of the world, liberalism is understood to be, the right way. And in fact, the only debates that remained in a Western and then in a global context in the 20th century were between like liberalism and socialism, right? So religion was really left behind for the most part, although, from this, again, 1970s, 80s onwards, that has changed in some regards. So it's a very dominant discourse in our time. That's why it's very important to understand. It doesn't, not just in a Dawa context, we live this. These are the ideologies that we live, right? Or these are societies dominated by the ideologies in which we live, right? So they're extremely important to understand. Okay, now let's move on to some of the more, that sort of history and development. Let's talk about some of the philosophical and the political principles and ikhtilafat within liberal schools. Like any other ideology, it's not a monolith. It's not like he's the orthodox position. There's a lot of differences, right? We're not going to go into all of them. That's not important for us because we want to move on and focus on morality, right? But just to give us some understanding, there are some philosophical principles. A philosophical principle is something to do with a more basic, fundamental understanding about what is the reality of the world and how we should organize society, You know, what's the good life? What is the good human life? How do we define that? How do we understand that? Right? Whereas political principles are more about how we organize our political affairs, our societal affairs. And obviously they're related to each other. So some of the principles on which there is a lot of difference, and therefore we get different types of liberalism, are the following. One, freedom versus equality. So as I said before, that liberalism emphasizes freedom and equality, right? But there is also a trade-off between freedom and equality, right? Particularly in the historical context, because liberalism came along with capitalism, which brought a lot of oppressive conditions, a lot of exploitation of the richer capitalist classes, the bourgeoisie, and the weaker, more poor classes, the working classes, right? If you want to look at it from a socialist, communist perspective or analysis. So whilst you had a lot of claims about freedom and equality, what you had domestically in Europe was a lot of inequality and a lot of oppressive conditions and a lot of disparities, right? Particularly following the Industrial Revolution. And what you had abroad was like straight out colonization, right? So, but let's focus domestically for a moment. There is a trade-off between freedom and equality in the way that liberals understand their own sort of way of life or their own ideology. And so they would debate things like, what's more important? Is it more important that we have less wage inequality, less wealth inequalities, or that people are free? Because in order to close the gap of wealth inequality, you're going to have to intervene into people's freedom and redistribute wealth, right? Now, at one level, we're not talking about socialism, right? Socialism will advocate, socialism is one of the contrasting ideologies to liberalism, and it will advocate a much more radical redistribution of wealth. So we're not going that far, but even within liberal societies, we do have redistribution of wealth, right? So for example, when you have a welfare state, that's what it does. When you have a taxation system that is, what's the word? Not bracketed, you know, the one where it's got different brackets. I forget there's a word for it, but different brackets. So when you tax the richer people more, which makes sense to us, right? Like they're richer, you tax them more, right? But you are doing that. There's an inequality there, and you're also cutting away at their freedom, because some people will argue, and some people do argue, right? So at one extreme of liberalism, you have libertarians, right, who argue for a lot more freedom and a lot less equality, right? And that's sort of how the spectrum turns out. You can put freedom on one side, equality on the other side, and you get a lot of different positions, right? But anyway, it's just important to understand some of the what this means by way of example, right? I can say, for instance, taxation is one example. Should we tax people or not? Right? If you tax, why are you taxing people, and why are you taxing the rich more? Well, you're taxing the rich more because you want to not eliminate, but at least close some of the gap, some of the wealth gap, and therefore redistribute wealth in a way that is a little bit more fair. Right? So the argument goes. But on the other hand, the freedom argument would be, no, let people do what they want. Let people free. It's not the job of the state to intervene and redistribute and tax and do these sort of things, right? Another way of looking at this, another example is like, and this debate has happened in different Western countries as well, to do with children and how much autonomy parents have and how much autonomy children have, right? In terms of what they teach their children, what they do and what they allow and disallow them, right? So there's a trade-off between, not equality in this case, but between autonomy and what they call value pluralism. All right, so some liberals will say, we value the freedom for people to practice their own cultures, right? And others will say, we value people being autonomous, and autonomous means literally autonomos, self-law. You decide for yourself how you live. And so others people will emphasize that and some cultures are not very autonomous, don't allow for as much autonomy for the individual, right? So what do you do now? Do you favor the value pluralism, let people do what they want, or do you value the autonomy and therefore stop people from doing what they want? And again, liberals have different answers to that. So anyway, the point here is just whether it be freedom and equality, the trade-off, the limits of freedom. What are the limits of freedom? There's some libertarians. So libertarianism is a sort of an extreme, one extreme of liberalism, where it's much more on the freedom side. So some libertarians will go to the extent of arguing that if a person voluntarily wants to enslave themselves to another human being, they should be allowed to do so, right? Whereas most liberals, I think all liberals, will say, no, well, you can't do that, because they will argue that freedom is an inalienable right. Inalienable means there's no way you can divest yourself of it. You can never be in a state where you don't have it. So even if you voluntarily wanted to give up your freedom, you can't. But that's a type of unfreedom, right? Or at least it's a qualification on the limits of your freedom, right? So anyway, autonomy versus value pluralism, the role and scope of the state, debates over this. Is it the role of the state to actively, fashion and create and facilitate liberal ways of life, or through hard power and soft power, right? Education and entertainment and whatnot? Or is the role of the state to be passive, just put the law, regulate things and leave people to do what they want? Again, there's debates about this, and because of that you get different schools. Again, there's a spectrum of focus on individualism versus communitarianism, and again on this, if you go to a certain extreme on the communitarian one, you end up being socialist or communist, right? But within liberal schools, there is a difference between how individualist you want to be, how much of a priority you want to give the individual, and how much of a priority you want to give family, community, culture, cultural groups, cultural identities, right? And also there's differences based on their views and differences on radical versus pragmatic change. Should change in society, when we see something that's not right, it's not liberal, should it be changed radically? A lot of liberals are in favor of that. Or should it be changed pragmatically and slowly, if at all, which is more of a conservative position, right? So anyway, these differences are what gives rise to your spectrum of different political parties, your liberals and your labours, and your right and your left. Although this is not fully the left-right spectrum, because I'm not yet talking about socialism, but nevertheless, you do get liberals on the left, and people actually say left liberals, right? So anyway, we don't need to go up to all of that. The point to take away here is, it's one thing to say we're about freedom and equality, but there's a lot of details, and a lot of these details lead to not only to differences, but to very controversial and hotly debated culture wars, right, in the West. And we've seen a lot of these in different parts of the time. Let me just have a look at the chat quickly. Here we go. Okay, what have we got here? Progressive. Oh yes, that's the word. Thank you, Hajar, for helping me out. When you have a progressive tax system, where you're taxing people different amounts. Wouldn't the harm principle be problematic in that sense? Don't some people argue that provided they're not harming themselves or anyone else, the state has no basis to interfere with the... Yeah, some people argue that. Right? We're actually going to come to the harm principle. We're not going to talk about the harm principle, but different types of liberal morality. But yeah, that's the point, right? So some people argue that, and other people argue against them. And what's happening there is, the point I understand is, there's trade-offs to be made between freedom and equality, between autonomy and cultural leeways, between the active state and the passive state, between being individualist and communal, right? Between being in favor of radical revolution and slow, pragmatic change, right, between favoring tradition over, new changes. And all of this is basically what explains all the ikhtilafat and the differences that we see around us in the so-called culture wars in the West, which can get quite heated and they get quite serious, right? People in the US, they've got weapons, they get armed about these things, right? And there's potential over there for there to be violence on this. That's how serious it gets. Part of that is just people don't understand where the difference is coming from and they overplay them and whatnot. Because by and large, all of them are still, by and large, liberal, right? The major parties, like in the US, the Republicans and the Democrats are not a socialist party, they're not a communist party, they're a liberal party, right? In the capital L liberal sense of the word. It's just that because of some of these differences that we're talking about now, their answers to particular questions about education, about healthcare, about foreign policy, about changes, about LGBT are different to the other side. That's it, right? Anyway, that's a good question, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. I should keep a track of time as well. Okay, 8:11. All right, let us to move on. I'm coming now very soon from the next slide. We'll talk about morality more specifically. Just one thing that I wanted to talk about before that. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm drinking a little bit here because otherwise my throat's going to go dry. Okay, so a little bit more about the point I made about theory and practice. So there's a theory about, liberalism is about freedom and, sorry, one second, the screen's gone away again. Oh, here we are. Okay. There's a theory about, we're about freedom and this and that, equality, blah, blah. But in actual practice, it's very different. And so it's important to know both of these. Like, it's not, it'd be a deficiency on our part if we said we're just going to focus on the theory. And it would also be a deficiency if we said we're going to ignore the theory because they're just hypocrites and that's all nonsense and we're going to focus on the practice, right? Why? Because there's a number of reasons, right? First of all, most ideologies, most ways of life, there's a gap between theory and practice because we're humans, right? Like even Muslims, if you look at Islamic history, it's not always and everywhere a reflection of Islam. In fact, by and large, it's not a reflection of Islam. So if someone says to you, oh, you talk about justice and mercy, look at this particular part of your history in 15th century, I don't know, Uzbekistan, or 15th century Baghdad, or modern Saudi Arabia, for example, right? Or the first state or second state, or whatever, right? What are you going to say? Most times you say, well, that's not Islam. That's a particular attempt, if that, in certain cases, to practice Islam by some Muslim, and they got it wrong, or they got it wrong in these aspects, right? So we accept that the theory can get it wrong. The practice can be, away from the theory. And so, in a sense, you do need to also refer to the theory because that's what the people are proposing. So if someone comes to me with a proposal and says, this is what I advocate, I say, okay, let me take your advocation on paper and here's what I have to say about it. But then I also want to look at the practice because practice is not always just because of the inability and because of human beings are fallible. Sometimes it's much more intrinsic to the ideology, and I think that's the case with liberalism because it's almost always been like that, right? And so that's what I want to talk about quickly here, which is that the theory is of talking about a free, autonomous, equal individual, all individuals. In practice, what that meant, in the 16th century, in the 17th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and still in different ways, but still now, that free, autonomous, equal individual is actually the white European secular male, right? As a starting point. And why do I say that? Because all the non-whites, people in Africa and people in Asia were considered to be inferior, right? European, because again, European ways of doing things, Anglo way of life was prioritized and privileged. Secular because non-secular you know, ways of practicing religion were thought to be backwards, and therefore they weren't considered as equal options, right? Males, because females weren't considered to be equal even to males or to males. So there was a gender inequality. Now, yes, over time, some of these gaps have closed to some extent, but really the difference, it's a change in modes. Sorry, I don't have the line. Yeah, it's a change in modes. It's not really a substantive change. So even today, very clearly, we've got severe problems of racism throughout the West. We've got severe issues of gender inequality and discriminations, structural levels on here, I mean, people on the street. Although obviously it's got various types of manifestations. Even today, secularism is privileged, right? And we still have a very Eurocentric way of looking at things. So what I want to say is, it's not as if it's exactly the same as it used to be, right? But that doesn't mean the oppressive core of it has changed in a substantive way, right? So you want to keep that in mind. Okay, let's move on to morality. Are there any questions at this point? Before we jump into now. So what we've done so far is look at liberalism, and now we're going to look more specifically at moral frameworks. Okay, I'll take that as a no. I should probably ask questions and maybe try and get interaction in that form. And we'll see how we go. Okay, so, all right, secular moral frameworks. What I put up here on this slide is a number of different secular moral frameworks. Moral frameworks here means, like, how do you decide what's moral and what's not moral, right? This is not the only thing that's relevant to morality. There are other important questions, like what does it even mean for something to be moral, right? What is the grounds of moral judgments in the world, what they call moral ontology? How do we know the moral from the immoral, which is moral epistemology, right? But let's just start here and we'll see. We're just going to talk about what's more relevant, right? Otherwise, each of these topics has too many details to it. Okay, so some, and again, even this slide is not exhaustive. These are just some of the major moral frameworks that modernity has given rise to. Consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics. So consequentialism is basically the idea that the morality of actions depends on their consequences. Now, which consequences, how, what? There's differences. A major school of thought, and this is a liberal one. So the ones that I've italicized on this thing are liberal moral frameworks, or significant liberal moral frameworks, right? Utilitarianism is one such thing. So utilitarianism is the idea that the morality of an action depends on the harms and benefits that it causes, that is consequent to the action. Or another way of looking at it is what's moral is what results in the greater good for the greatest number, right? Mil. Right. So this is about, it's about utility. If it gives us more benefit at an individual and at a societal level, whichever one you're looking at, then it's moral. If it gives more benefit, more pleasure, it's moral. If it gives more harm, more pain, then it's immoral. Right? That's how they look at it. Hedonism is more to do with just maximizing personal pleasure. So it's lacking the sort of greater good aspect to it. So that's one way, that's one secular moral framework, consequentialism. So the morality of action depends on its consequences. Another one is deontology. Deon is a Greek word, as is ology or logi from logos. Deon refers to rule or obligation, right? So it's a study of rules, or an account of rules, and a logos of rules and obligations. So this framework basically says there are fixed moral rules and obligations that we have to obey, right? And now what these are, how we understand them differs. We've got Kantianism, where he argues that human rationality can by itself arrive at these moral rules. So basically rationally derived moral rules, and he came up with a number of them, like the categorical imperative and others. We have a natural rights theory, which is well, there are still people that do that, but it's more of a early modern thing. Natural, which basically is to say that people have natural rights. So this is a bit different to human rights, although human rights is like a development on this in a sense. Natural rights is like naturally by fact of being human beings and originally creations of God, people have fixed rights and obligations, right? And then we also have contractarianism or a contractarian approach, which is basically saying that morals are those things which we in society come to agree to, right? So moral norms, how do we figure out moral norms? Well, we come together and we discuss and we decide what they are, right? And it's called contractarian because it's based on this idea of a social contract, right? Or a contract between people. Voluntarily we engage each other, or, differently. This is about the logistics, right? But since we can't have a direct democracy where everyone comes together as they apparently used to in Athens, not everyone, but some people come together and decide how to do things. We have representatives, we have representative democracy, we go to the ballot box and we choose people, and then the MPs in the parliament, they decide. But basically it's still working off this idea of a social contract between the government and the people. So that's another approach. 1 second, there's a comment in the chat. I think there's a lag when I click on it. Tell you when it actually shows up. Okay, we have a question. What are your thoughts on the idea that these liberal ideas remain so pervasive today because they were so entrenched within the racist ideology that justified and informed colonialism, the extent the states are still decolonizing themselves from such cultural radicalism? With regards to the previous slide. Okay, I want to read that again because there's a lot of content there. What are your thoughts on the idea that these liberal ideas remain pervasive because they're entrenched within racist ideology? Okay, so because the decolonization process hasn't, I guess, come to fruition, we still have largely racist ideology. Yeah, I mean, based on what I said in the previous slide, that would largely be true, and I think it's true. That there has been a change, but it's not a substantive change, right? So one way of saying that would be that modern Western states and even modern Western populations are still, by and large, racist. That's what BLM is about, right? Like that's why you still get clear structural inequalities to do with, for example, Black people in America, and other similar scenarios, Indigenous people in Australia, and the Native Indians in America as well, and you've got this everywhere. So the fact that those issues are still there is, I think, justification, or is substantiates the fact that there is still a very that white supremacy or that Eurocentric ideology still survives and is still quite potent, in spite of having changed some of its forms and some of the ways it plays out and whatnot, right? So it's like, the problem people have, I guess, here is that before, people were like, Black people in America were just like lynched and it was fine, it was okay, they were enslaved, they were slaves, they were treated horrendously. Now that doesn't happen, so people think, oh look, there's been a massive change, what are you talking about, right? But what is failed to be understood is just because a mode changes doesn't mean it's not still there. And in fact, even that brutality is still there, it's in different form. So consider the fact that, the war on terror, A war on terror is like America saying, we were attacked on 9/11, 2,000-3,000 of our people were killed. We're going to go and blow up a whole country in the Muslim world, in fact, 2 countries, and destroy them to smithereens. Right? So, and not only that, it's that 9/11 changes the world. 9/11 is the beginning of a new epoch. This changes everything. What does it change everything? Obviously, it's wrong for innocent civilians to be killed, right? But 100 to 1,000 people dying in the Muslim world, in Africa and Asia, has been the norm for years because of American and European foreign policy, right? So the point is just that the brutality takes a different form, and sometimes people have hardship just seeing that aspect. Okay, so consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics is another approach that some people are making a return to. It's actually a pre-modern form of ethics. It's Aristotelian, all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Virtue ethics is about saying that, look, morality and ethics is not so much about rules, and it's not about consequences. It's about developing character. It's about developing character traits, virtues, right? Courage, selflessness, truthfulness, diligence, etc., etc. And there's lots of virtues that we can point to. So this is a pre-modern way of thinking, and that's why it's actually a bit closer to the theist, Islamic, Christian ways of thinking, right? Where even in Islam, what's important is that we develop the character and develop the virtue, right? The fadila. And Muslim scholars have written about this a lot, some based off Aristotle himself and others separate to that. Anyway, so these are a number of secular moral frameworks that, and some of which are more tied to liberalism, like utilitarianism, like Kantianism, like contractarian approaches. Now from that, I want to talk more about that when I compare with the Islamic framework. I don't want to say too much about the Islamic framework now because we're all Muslims and you know it. So very briefly, in the Islamic approach to morality, moral judgments are the right of Allah. They're the haqq of Allah. Allah Ta'ala makes not just moral, but judgments about how people should live, what's right and wrong, what's permissible and impermissible, what's obligatory, what's haram, etc. These are conveyed via revelation and they are embodied by prophetic examples, right? Embodied means they take a concrete shape in the actions and in the life of prophets, right? Because otherwise it's just a theory, but you have the actual life form. Not just prophets, obviously, and the tradition is carried on by the companions of prophets and by by Muslims, by pious people, by scholars, etc. So now this aspect, what's important is to talk about the contrast. Now, just a little bit of detail in terms of the Islamic aspect. There are details, there are discussions amongst Muslim scholars, Muslim theologians, in particular, in this case, scholars of Aqidah, about morality and about moral judgments. They don't use that terminology because that's not our terminology, but if you're talking about the same thing, there's a debate in books of Aqidah about what they call husn and qubh, goodness and badness, or good and evil, or beauty, literally beauty and ugliness, right? And there's many aspects to it. The one relevant to us is a question about what's the basis of judgment on the beauty and ugliness of actions. So just to say good and evil, right? To simplify things. What's the basis of judgment on an action being good or bad, or good or evil, right? Is it the shara? Is it the judgment of Allah, or is it the mind? Can the mind make these judgments or not? And the general answer is that it's the realm of, as I said, it's the right of Allah, and it's the Sharia, the Shara, the revelation tells us the judgment on the moral judgment on actions. However, there is some details here, and scholars, and there's ikhtilafat here, details. I'm just presenting one standard view. Scholars differentiate between different aspects of the action. This is important because there are some types of judgments on actions that the mind can do and does do, and there's no problem with that, right? Others, are more subject to ikhtilaf and controversy, and the Mu'tazila and whatnot. So one way of distinguishing between the different aspects on how we judge an action is its reality, right? Its accordance or discordance with our fitrah, with the natural human disposition. And number 3, with whether it warrants praise or not, and whether it attracts reward or punishment. Now, okay, this could be a bit abstract. Let me try and simplify this by using an example. Murder is wrong, or lying. Let's say lying. The act of lying, right? When I ask the question, what does it mean to say lying is immoral or lying is bad, right? Lying is bad. It could actually mean a number of things, right? It could be a judgment about the reality of it, about what it is, right? But when you're saying that, you're not, these 1, 2, 3 are mutually exclusive to each other. You're not necessarily saying it's bad, you got to be punished. You're saying the reality of it is bad. And a better example than lying here for the first one, number 1 reality, the example the scholars give is knowledge and ignorance, right? The reality of knowledge is that it's good. It teaches you about the world. It broadens your horizon, right? And generally speaking, we're not talking about different types of knowledge, beneficial, non-beneficial, right? We're just saying knowledge generally, as opposed to ignorance generally, the reality of the two is that knowledge is good and ignorance is bad, right? And the mind can make that judgment. There's no problem with that. But it doesn't carry with it normative implications, as in number 3. Likewise, accordance with the fitrah. I can say lying is bad, murder is bad, and what I mean is that the human natural disposition is has nafra. It does not like, it inclines away from these things. That's true. That's empirically true, right? Because I feel it, you feel it, he feels it, and over time, this thing is generalized, and it becomes a sort of a fact that the human fitrah is attracted to certain things, and it is disattracted or unattracted to other things, right? Again, so therefore, again, the mind can make that judgment. It's number 3, however, that is the most important, and what we generally mean when we talk about morality and immorality, and where the mind by itself cannot make the judgment, which is to say that something is right or wrong in the meaning that if someone does it, they should be praised or censured if it's bad, and rewarded and punished in this world and in the akhirah, right? And or depending on the action. So it's the last one that is more the subject of, more relevant to the subject, and that's the one that in Islam the Sharia decides on. But the reason I'm putting this is to show that it wouldn't be right to say that the mind can't make any judgments and it can't do anything. That would come across as just wrong, but also unnecessarily stubborn, and would be based on ignorance of this kind of thing in any case. So that's that. Now, backwards. Right. Yep. Okay. So 8:30. All right. 7:30, 9:30. Okay. So I want to try and wrap this up in 15 minutes and then open the floor for Q&As. Okay, comparative. I mean, let us now compare between the Islamic and the secular frameworks. Now, the first thing you should perhaps recognize here is the way I presented them. It's actually difficult to compare them. Right. So on the one hand, we've got consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics. On the other hand, you're saying we're going to refer to the revelation. There's just a gap. How are you going to even compare these two? Right? And therefore, you need to take a step back. right, and go to some of the fundamentals. Because what's happening in all the secular frameworks is basically it's human reason deciding on its own. It's just that the criteria of the judgment that the human reason is to use is differed upon. Is it the consequences? Is it some rules? Is it the development of certain character? Right? But it's human reason. Whereas in the Islamic framework, it's divine revelation. And so if you take that step back, you realize that there's a difference in grounding here. And if we had to compare, we have to go to this level. We have to say, okay, so the actual difference is between the human judgment and the divine judgment, right? And therefore, in any discussion with a liberal or a secular, a person advocating for a secular moral framework or a liberal framework, that's where we're going to have to speak. Otherwise, that don't correspond, right? Like I can't respond to consequentialism by saying, God said this. You have to at least first point out what's happening, which is that consequentialism, utilitarianism, presupposes that morality is the domain of human reason, whereas we contest that. And so let us talk about this first. Right, so the discussion, in other words, returns to the foundations of the respective worldviews, and basically what we have here are what we might call theocentric versus anthropocentric paths or views, God-centric basically, and human-centric, right? Where one path centers Allah and life is about seeking His pleasure, Islam, and the other one centers the human being and life is about making the most of it. So the point is the worldview is different. The approach to life is different. And that's why within it, the moral frameworks are different. So we have to take that further step to talk about the foundations. And that's generally the case when you're having a discussion with someone or a debate with someone about something that's not, like they're not corresponding. It's because there's presuppositions that are different and you need to go back to them in order for the discussion to be fruitful and even meaningful. Okay, so given that, so let us now take that step and look at this from a perspective of human versus divine, and come back to the question of how would we critique liberal morality. There's a number of ways we can do this, or a number of points. I think I've got 3 here. They're related to each other, but it's about unpacking them that's important. So pay particular attention here, inshallah. First of all, so now we're critiquing the liberal moral frameworks, all of them, right? Because the point is we're not interested in this debate between is it about consequences or is it about rules or is it about that. What we're interested in, all of these go back to human judgments and people coming together to decide, and therefore we're focusing on that. And one thing that we can say here very clearly is that in all those models, the moral judgments are basically subjectively generated social conventions, right? What does that mean? Two things are being said here. That moral judgments in all those frameworks are subjective, they are not objective, right? Some of them claim objectivity, like the Kantian approach, but most of the others will, again, they may claim otherwise, but that's where you have the discussion. They are subjectively generated. Subjective here means like it's what different people, based on their own subjective interests and opinions and judgments, decide, right? Which is what social conventions are. It's like when people come together to agree on something, right? Moral judgments. So in all those things, moral judgments, in the end, what are they? They are social conventions, right? Yet they are asserted as being universal and natural and objective, right? So that's one point of critique, to say, hang on a minute, the assumption here that it's universal, it's natural, it's objective, but it's not. And, with examples that can be shown. And we'll talk about that a bit now. So there's a chat question. Let me just open the chat. Just takes time to show up on my way. Okay, there's a question here or a comment. I was having a conversation at the Dawah store once, and the lady was saying that she feels that we Muslims do good to please Allah and stay away from wrong crime to avoid His punishment. Then to her that means we don't do things out of the goodness of our heart, altruistically, or because these things align with our morals, but rather we do them selfishly. What are your thoughts? Okay, that's a good question. Let's park that for now, because what we're talking about now we'll actually address it, and we'll speak more explicitly about it soon. I'm losing my voice now. So one straightforward criticism is to say, is to appreciate that these moral frameworks are actually just subjectively generated. They're not objective. They're not universal. What does that mean? Let's take an example, right? Let's take a basic example. Most of the moral frameworks will say that murder is wrong. Although obviously there's details to that, but let's say, like, let's specify, murdering an innocent child as they walk to school. I'm doing that because obviously in some cases murder, killing someone else, will be justified with moral, like in war, for example, in a just war, or, even in their view. So, but killing a child as they walk to school who has done nothing to you, etc., you can make the relevant qualifications, is wrong. But what does that mean? It's immoral. But what does that mean? Right? What they're actually saying is we have determined it to be wrong. Okay, but who are you? Right? In the greater scheme of things, what value can we give to a human judgment? And what if some other human being, equally human as you, says, I disagree? Then they may not disagree on that very clear example, or they may. But there were many other contentious moral issues that disagree, right? In the end, what are they going to do then? Or are they going to say, okay, well, we're going to go with the majority decision? But again, the question is, what's the value of that majority decision? It's just human beings, right? It's just human beings that have come up with that judgment. Why should, this is the point. I think I've got on the next thing here, I should.
Okay, I think it stopped from Brother Uthman's side. Yeah, it's probably bad connection. Just give us like 5 minutes or so, or 2 minutes. Sorry for that.
Sorry guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I think I dropped, I think it was the internet connection.
It's all
fallen
good.
away.
No worries.
Okay, so let me continue now. I'm gonna have to share screen. Okay, all right. Now, so where were we?
I think you were answering the question. Do you want me to read out the question? Probably went away for you.
No, I've got it here now.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question. Does your one critique suggest that non-Islamic understandings of morality such as morality are imagined constructs? I mean, you can put it that way, but it depends on what you mean by imagined constructs. I'm not saying they're imaginary in the sense that they're not real. All that's being said is that they're basically their basis is a human judgment, and at most it's the judgment of a majority of people. And now, why is that important? This is what was there. This is where I was. Like, why should one human being's judgment oblige another human being? Right? Okay, let's say it's not one, it's the majority. So what? Why should the majority's view oblige anyone else? Now, keep in mind, this is within a secular and therefore by and large naturalistic framework as well, right? But we'll come to that. I don't want to, that's a separate line of critique. What's important is you can't actually prove that you can't substantiate moral obligation based on social conventions, because it's just conventions. Now, keep in mind, the other thing is important to understand, what does it mean to be a social convention? Like, fashion is a social convention. Language is a social convention, right? And usually, human beings self-ascribe to these things voluntarily because there's a practical benefit in doing so, right? Language, right? So language is a social convention. That means the reason we call, the blue thing, the blue thing in the sky is because it's conventional. There's nothing skyish about the sky or tree-ish about the tree. It's just words, right? Now, and so therefore, some people come up with some words, people agree to use them. You can't oblige people with them, right? Now, the reason people will use them is because I want myself to be understood. So if I start calling the sky a tree, I'm not going to be understood. So it's a practical concern, right? Likewise with fashion. Fashion is a bit more like, maybe there's not a practical concern there as much, but fashion is a social convention. And the point is, people breaking social conventions are at most being unfashionable. But you can't punish them for that, right? So what's the argument here? The argument from their side is here to say, well, and again, it's a practical one. We need this because otherwise society wouldn't function, and it wouldn't function, right? It would not function if there wasn't, clear enough moral judgments and laws based on them that people were accountable to, right? It would be chaos, it would be anarchy. But what that proves is your fundamental basis is just practicality. It's practicality needs this, therefore we're going to do it like this. But you don't have any solid grounds for making a case for moral obligation. Now compare this with Islam. Again, this will help to understand the point as well a bit more. When we in Islam say murder is wrong, what we're actually saying is Allah Ta'ala has judged murder amongst human beings to be wrong. Now, why is that an obligation on everyone? Because Allah Ta'ala is the creator of the heaven and the earth. He created us, and the judgment belongs to Him. Right now, here, people may say, hang on a minute, but that's your belief. People don't believe in God. We have to differentiate the issue of substantiation with coherence of a framework. Within an Islamic framework, that makes absolute sense. Allah Ta'ala exists. Allah Ta'ala makes the judgments. Human beings are creations of Allah. Therefore, they are obliged by this, right? That makes sense. It's coherent. The question of substantiation is a separate one. How do you prove God exists, and the rest of which is something which is also a relevant discussion, right? But when we come to the liberal side, it's not even coherent. It's like, particularly with a naturalistic framework, in a naturalistic framework where you say we are just evolved creatures, we are just the result of time and chance and random mutations and natural selection, Okay, so therefore you're no different to the cockroaches or the ants and insects and the trees and the plants. Fine. So in the end, your judgment has no real value except what you give to it, right? So how can you oblige someone else? How can you hold someone else accountable, right? It's like, to put it in crude terms, it's like one cockroach, to use that I've mentioned that as an example. It's like one cockroach saying to another cockroach, I think this, therefore I'm going to do this to you, right? Now, in the end, what it is or what it would be if they didn't do this would be the rule of the jungle, which is sort of what happens, apart from the natural order of Allah, which is what happens in the jungle, right? So we say it's the rule of the jungle. But my point is just that without simply coming up with rules and simply enforcing them, because otherwise there'll be anarchy, liberal moral frameworks have no grounds to actually be coherent and show that there's a solid ground here. Another comment, 1 second. Is this like considering morality from a post structures? I'm not sure if that's a reference to the previous question or to something I said or to what I'm explaining. Please, my one is definitely not. It's not looking at it from a post structures perspective. So now come back to the question, original one by Sayyida. Are liberal moral frameworks imagined constructs? Actually, that wasn't the question, it was the previous question, which I can't say anymore. Right? I think I already answered this one. That depends on what you mean by imagined. If you mean subjectively generated, then yes. But they're not unreal, they are real, right? But it's just like, what's the basis of them? And if they are purely social conventions, then you don't really have grounds to enforce them on other people, but that's exactly what you're doing. And the way you sort of do that is by just asserting them as universal and natural, but they're not universal. People disagree with them, right? And they're definitely not natural as well. And therefore, the moral framework lacks coherence and it lacks substantiation. These are two different things. Substantiation is to prove something. Coherence is, so if I say X is Y, A is B, C is D, these are three different propositions. Each of them needs evidence for why A is B and X is Y and C is D. But if they're part of one framework, they should not contradict one another. That's what I mean by coherence. And so the liberal moral framework lacks coherence because it's naturalistic, but again, it just creates this, it just asserts moral judgments and moral meaning and value and whatnot. And it also lacks substantiation. Imagine in the sense that we need these conventions to function, otherwise chaos. Yeah, yes. So we've addressed that. If that's what you mean by imagine, then yes, that's what they basically are. Like the point is, they don't have a ground. Like you can interrogate a liberal moral assertion all the way back to its foundation, and there will be nothing there except saying this is what we think is right. But your other basis is to say human freedom. So if you think that's right and I say it's not right, why does your view get preference? Is it purely because it's a majority rule and there's no actual substantive ground, rational ground to come up with that? And this is a problem they put you in. Let's say some society, the majority decides that murder is okay. And that's happened. Not murder is okay per se, but in particular, Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler was actually elected to power, right? And then obviously he made certain changes and got rid of democracy. But a lot of the society went along with him. And it's actually arguable that it was the majority of the society that, if not in active support, were passive enough to passively support him. So now as a liberal, will you say that the Nazis, what they did was moral because it was the majority rule? So you see, it puts you into conundrums. And that's the point, that you don't have, there's no real rational substantiation out of that. You have to assert, and they do assert, certain fundamental rights, and proposition, moral norms that they can't then substantiate rationally. It's just an assertion. And in the end, no, I'd be forced to say it's self-evident, right? But clearly it's not self-evident. Okay, and so I think this is the final, yeah, this is the final slide, right? So we are wrapping up. I know it's been long. An example of this is human rights. And we said we talked about this before anyway. Sorry, just one more. I think there's another comment or a question in the chat. Just have a quick look at that. Didn't Mill consider this question of the tyranny of the majority privileging the voices of the educated? Yeah, he did, and that's one way of doing it, but it's not a foolproof way, and others disagree with him. You can do it in this way, because sometimes the educated are part of the majority who decide to do their own thing. All right, and we see this in Nazi Germany as an example. Even lots of educated people, they were actually otherwise considered enlightened philosophers that went along with the Nazi regime. Right? And then there's obviously debates about why and how, but people like Martin Heidegger, very, very influential philosopher of the 20th century, and many others, right? And you don't have to go that far. Like even today, in more benign ways, you have things like, for example, the war on terror. The war on terror is a very good example, where it finds large-scale support in Western societies, right? But people on the receiving end, Muslims, us, know that it's a complete farce, and it's very discriminatory, it's very exploitative, much more so in the Muslim world, right? Where it's led to war and occupation and whatnot. So anyway, come back to the example of human rights. So most liberal frameworks will assert, like all of them now, will assert as a fundamental starting point human rights. Everyone has universal, inalienable human rights. Right to life, right to freedom, right to this, right to that. And again, if you ask them, say, where do these rights come from? How do they have these rights? There's no answers. It's just, you have the rights. But how do you have the rights? Like is a child, like a child is born, we see the physical features, hands and fingers and feet. We don't see any rights. You're asserting something, right? And again, as I said, particularly in a naturalist framework, which is the one that goes more hand in glove with secularism and therefore with liberalism, it's even harder to assert rights. Like, how did the evolutionary process, whilst it was doing its thing, leave you with human rights, right? It's a blind process. There's no intelligence, no will. It's just chemical reactions initially, and then biological reactions, and then natural selection, and random mutations and that sort of stuff. Right? It's cold hard physics, if you will, and chemistry and biology. Right? Where do you get human rights in that? You don't. There's no room to just assert meaning and values and moral judgment and the rest of it, right? But that's the point. They have to do it, because without that, life doesn't work. And that's effectively what they do. That's what practical reason is. Practical reason is basically saying we can't strictly theoretically substantiate this, but we need it for life to work properly, and in the way that we would like, and therefore we'll assert it. Basically, what Kant did with his practical reason. So, in that sense, human rights are a good example, right? And the point there is not that you disagree. You have to be careful. You don't want to come across as saying we don't think human beings have the right to life. The whole point is that human rights is a particular ideological liberal conception of these rights. We Muslims believe, for example, that human beings have a right to life because Allah Ta'ala gave them that right. And just as He gives them that right, He takes it away based on certain realities, where it becomes okay in certain situations of war, in certain situations of crime, right, murder, and certain had punishments, had capital punishment, etc. But that's a very different framework. In the liberal framework, however, when you assert the right to life, I'm not saying I think it's okay to kill people, right? And if someone interprets it as that, they're not being serious, or they're misunderstanding is clarified. Rather, I'm questioning, how did you come to these rights? How can you assert them? right? What's the grounds of them? And you find that there are no grounds. Anyway, so I want to stop there. I think enough has been said. In the last slide, here, just some broad conclusions to bring us back to the larger context, Dawah context, which is, this is one topic, morality. There are many other topics, right? The existence of God and evolution and science and religion and politics, and there's lots of topics, right? What can we take away in that context from this type of discussion? Be confident about your deen, be confident about its strength, about its superiority, but with compassion and humility, right? So there's a delicate balance here. We do believe that Islam is the best, it's strong, it's in terms of its coherence, its substantiation, in terms of it is the best way of life, and it's a superior way of life. But doing that with humility means understanding that that's not because of me, Uthman or Junaid or, Muhammad or Raif, just reading off the names that I can see, right? It's not because of us as individuals. We're not the one that, it's because of Allah Ta'ala. It's because it's Allah's determined way of life. It's Allah's revealed way of life. It's the way of life shown by the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? And so therefore, I shouldn't become arrogant because of that, and that shouldn't be my approach of da'wah, right? Compassion in da'wah means to understand that if someone is on the wrong path, it's not necessarily because, it's not because of them. They could be ignorant, they didn't get the message, they don't understand, whatever. So I give them husn al-dhan, unless it's been established otherwise, and I confidently yet with humility pass them the message, right? Now, this also implies that it's important to know our deen, to learn it, to practice it, and to carry it. So the confidence is not just an empty confidence. It should be a confidence based on knowledge, based on learning, and leading to practice and to carrying the deen and to giving da'wah, right? But this is very brief points because I know you've already had a da'wah workshop. The point is, in the end, we need knowledge, we need understanding, both of our deen and of the other ways of life which we are critiquing, or to whose people we are carrying our da'wah. And that's the more specific context in which today's type of discussion fits. It's important to understand liberal ways of life. It's important to understand liberal morality when doing these discussions. But of course, knowledge, understanding, and adab are extremely important as well. Otherwise, you skew in the wrong direction. It's sometimes very easy, particularly in early stages, to start learning the knowledge, to become overconfident, and then to adopt an approach that does more damage than good, right? And therefore, it's important to have that balance as well. But I'm going to stop here. That's all I had anyway. Stop sharing the screen. And over to you guys. Or technically, I think we're going to 9:30, but it's up to you. If anyone needs to leave, they can leave as well. I know it's late. Well, it's late in Australia, but I think most people here are from Australia. Some, I think, are from overseas. But feel free to leave. Feel free to take the mic, ask the question, make a comment, use the chat box, and let's see if there's any questions and answers.
I got a comment. So basically, what I took, I think you can correct me. What I took from this is that liberalism, basically, it's purely based on your own desires and stuff. So they don't have a moral objective framework, and first, because of that, they themselves have a lot of differing schools of thoughts where they themselves argue between each other about what exactly is morally good or morally bad. And that causes a lot of problems because you got like people like colonialism in the past, and even today with the war on terror, where Muslim life is cheaper than animals, or then cheaper than white life. And so yeah, it's as if liberalism is only applied when the majority see it okay, or the ones in power see it okay, which is US or Australia, I mean the Western world today. So yeah, that's what I got from it.
Yeah, that's fairly accurate. I'll just be careful with the first part about it's all based on desires. I don't think it's all based on desires. I think the desires come in, and that's what we actually get in practice. A lot of desires, capital interests, or the interests of capitalists, money talks, and whatnot. And so what happens in fact is a certain more wealthy, more influential class dominates. But in origin, when we're looking at the theory, I wouldn't say it's based on desires, it's based on their attempt at rational judgment, right?
Okay.
But of course, the human being is subject to bias, discrepancy, the environment, right? And so the various different opinions are a function of that, right? So I would include desires as one aspect, but I wouldn't reduce it to say that liberal moral frameworks are just people's desires, right? No, there's a lot of them are sitting, a lot of scholars are sitting and trying to figure out what to do. They're trying to, and in some cases, they're trying to put aside their personal thing and go, okay, what would we come up with if we wanted to come up with a more fair society, like John Rawls, right? He does all sorts of thought experiments as an analytic philosopher to come up with his idea of political liberalism and a theory of a just society, right? So that's how I look at it. But yes, in practice, it's a whole different thing. Like there's a massive wedge between the theory and the practice. And what you get, as I said, is, you know, the stronger, more influential classes really get their way, and the stronger majority culture gets its way, right? Yes. And it happens in sort of these very subtle ways where they still, like, they're actually being very discriminatory, but they're still claiming to be, you know, about freedom and equality and whatnot. How do they do it? By just saying things like, for example, okay, how do they, like, as Muslims, we feel this, right? This is not even a theory for us. Like, we live through the war on terror. We live through being told that this aspect of yours is backward and this is like that and that's like that.
Yeah.
And you're like, what happened to all the freedom and what happened to all the respect and this and that, right? It's because even in the scholarly theories, they'll say, like, okay, we're going to try and allow for all ways of life, but all reasonable ways of life, right? We're not going to tolerate intolerance. We're not going to be reasonable with non-rational, non-reasonable. And then what they do is they'll cast your particular beliefs as intolerant or backward or just not reasonable, right? But what makes it not reasonable? You just judge that because you set up your own criteria, right? And so in the end, although liberalism in most of its forms tries to put itself as neutral, it's not neutral. It's very, very ideological, and it's just one particular ideology that is imposed in a particular way, and it's very difficult to not see that in practice. But again, in the theory, people will say, yeah, the practice is not perfect, we've got room for improvement, but here's what we think it should be like. And so we can also critique that from a theoretical perspective.
How do you think, another question, sorry. Wait, before I ask this, I'll just give a quick reminder. For the UNSW students, please fill out the form. It's an awkward reminder that allows us to have events like this. Back to the question. So I even see that, like, you know, in Middle Eastern countries, you know, or even any other third world country where Western ways of life, like culturally I'm speaking about, they're seen as more, you know, more modern and more if you're more educated. For example, if you were, you know, what do you say, kandora, like a thobe or something, another abaya, and if you wear jeans and pants or something like that, or you listen to Western music or watch Western TV shows, you know, you're seen as, I guess, you're put to a high pedestal. And I think, you know, culturalism as well, what do you think? Like, do you think it's cultural wise, do you think liberal ideas are widespread in the Muslim world because of culturalism, or politically by the governments? So is it the people that's in fault or the governments?
I think it's more because of what we can call a cultural colonialism, right? And that works both ways. It's not always necessary through the government, but there are government, education, media, and it's also through just spreading ideas amongst the people through these mechanisms and otherwise. But that was one leg of colonialism. So when Western nations colonized the Muslim world, it wasn't just about resources or just about politics. It was also, there was a cultural aspect to it, to push this culture. And some of them thought they were doing it because they were civilizing people who are otherwise not as civilized as they are, right?
Yeah.
For others, that was just a ruse to, get their actual objectives, which I think is in the majority of the case. But that's where you get that, and obviously that influences people. People take up those ideas, and generally, when something is dominant in the world or in a particular society, then people look at to it in a certain way, and they understand it in a certain way, and then doing the other stuff makes you go against the grain, and it becomes difficult and whatnot. So it's a self-perpetuating thing. So like the examples you mentioned, also like if you just speak English, if you speak English well, and if you speak English with an English accent, right, or an American or an Australian accent,
100%.
you put up on a certain pedestal, right? So that means there's certain cultural ideas, and there's a long history of how they've come to be there. But then that's part of what we might call the cultural leg or aspect of colonialism.
Yeah. Does anyone else have questions? I have another question. Okay, now that we spoke about liberalism and how flawed their ideology is, it's widespread in the, around us. So like for example, at a job, I once didn't shake hand with this woman, and she was Australian, and she said that why didn't you shake that, like Islam, Islam's meant to be private, like it's Australian values. So I could have gone, like what you said, like give her a big essay on how flawed the ideology is, but like how do you approach these subtle, because most of the time it's these subtle instances. So how do you like explain to them that they're wrong? Like they just be quiet, or
all right, there's a couple of questions on the thing as well. I'll come to those. This is a good one as well. So what that is, right? You're right. It's one thing to understand in detail these things, and what we did today is just to start, right? I encourage people to go back and look at other information on liberalism and morality and whatnot over time. But it's another thing to be able to apply that in a particular situation, and that's what you need. Generally, you're not going to have a long time to give someone a long-winded explanation. So, but that's the case with everything, right? Like, a Muslim might ask you a fiqh question, right? Or they might have a particular wrong understanding of Islam. So that's about application. And what that requires is, number one, a good understanding of the subject matter. And number two, it requires a little bit of thought about how in different scenarios you might enter the discussion or execute the point. Now there's going to be different situations. There's your situation there where really, if you're going to say anything, you might have 5 minutes max, if that. In fact, you might just have 2 minutes before you're going to go in and do the interview. Other times you're on the train and maybe you've got half an hour with the person who says something, right? So there's a number of different scenarios, and there's no rule of thumb, but it's about, in the end, you do have to get to the point, but in each scenario it will be different. So, and obviously the less time you have, the harder it is, right? And that's why it becomes more difficult to think about how you can do it. So with a scenario like your one where, maybe it's a job interview, maybe you just generally work and you haven't shaken their hand and they've sort of, most people these days won't really attack you for that. They generally understand, at least from a cultural perspective, even though the ideas they might hold in their mind are a bit different, but they won't show it. But if someone actually says something like that to you, now you've got to think, what's the quickest way to address it in that small amount of time, right? That depends on what exactly they've said to you, right? Have they just asked why you don't do it? I think it's difficult in a very short meeting scenario to open up the discussion. The best you can do there is try and establish a rapport with the person and see if you can have a discussion separately. Maybe you had their email because there's a connection, right? And so what you do there is we should never be aggressive, even if they're aggressive in these type of scenarios. We're talking about everyday people, right? We're talking about some enemy of Islam who is after you. So you assume ignorance, you assume maybe they don't know, and you'll see that on as any discussion progresses. So maybe build a rapport with them, and try and just take the discussion elsewhere to try and open it up, right?
That's true.
And it depends on scenario to scenario, really. I haven't faced that particular one. Most of scenarios that I think that I faced and that you guys will face in the university context, you have a bit more time. Like you're at the Dawah store and someone comes. Actually, I reminded there was a question, wasn't there, about them? Someone comes to the Dawah store and says, what was it?
Yeah. Someone said that you Muslims here, you do good because Allah tells you, whereas
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was before I got cut off the internet. So that's a good question. Someone comes and says that the reason you're being moral is because your God asks you to, and I guess it's to avoid punishment and the reward. So first of all, that's a good sort of context where you've got time. Assuming you've got time, you can open that up. And again, it's a good way to build. It's still good to build a rapport, and it's still good to acknowledge something about the question, not to be dismissive straight out, even though what you're saying is wrong, right? But you don't want to be dismissive straight out. If you be dismissive straight out, you'll actually shut them down, and they're not listening to you, even when they're listening to you. They're just listening to you because they don't want to sound rude and walk off, right? So acknowledge something in the question, right? Look, it may come across as it's being done for this, but actually, the reason Muslims, we don't do it solely for the reward and punishment. We actually do it for Allah's pleasure, to seek His pleasure, right? And that is within, this is what you want to get to in the discussion, this is within a broader understanding of the world and an understanding of the reality of the world. Allah Ta'ala created the world, there's a hereafter, there's a world, and so on and so forth. And then you move on to particular aspects that will clarify for her what she's talking about. So, first of all, in that type of a question, where she's coming from, this idea that you're being altruistic, right? So you're being good for the purpose of being good. There's two frameworks in which you can do that. In a framework that is God-centric or a framework that is human-centric. Most likely it's from the latter one. So it's most likely a secular biblical conception. But in that one, again, the problem you have is, what does it mean to be altruistic? That's one line that I would clarify with her. What does it mean to be altruistic? So you're telling me I should speak truth, be good, because it's good to be good. What does that mean? You see, again, there's some assumptions like, I'm being selfless, I'm being good because what does it mean to be good in a scenario where God doesn't exist in their understanding, right? Again, what does that mean? So you have to push her back on, or take her back to the discussion about her worldview. Ask her about what she believes about the world. And she might say, for example, now, and this is where it changes, she could be a Christian, could be an atheist. But let's say a likely scenario, atheist or secular person who says, I believe in evolution and human being, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But being good for the sake of being good makes no sense in an evolutionary context. It goes back to what I said about cockroaches and ants. Because that's what you are. Like it carries no meaning for you to be good. It's just if you want to do it good, fine, but it doesn't really carry any meaning to it. Because in the evolutionary context, human beings have come literally from nothing, right? They're going towards nothing, just complete nothingness. You're going to die and that's it. It's all over. And between that nothing where you came from and the nothing that you're going to, it's just, as I said, chemical reaction. It's just brute physics, chemistry, and biology, right? Reactions, random mutations. Right? So there is no concept of the good. The being good doesn't mean anything other than this is what we decided on being good on our path from nothing towards nothing. Now, obviously, I'm saying it in these more crude ways, but you can explain it in a better way to her to try and show her that it's not just about, because what she's doing, and this is what commonly happens, she's putting forward a critique of Islam based on her worldview. Whereas that makes no sense because the Muslims don't ascribe to her worldview. right? Which is also why I can have an Islamic position about liberalism, but that's not what is going to convince the liberal. So for example, the Islamic one Islamic way of dismantling liberalism would be say it goes against the revelation. It goes against everything Allah says in the Quran. Right? Allah says this in the Quran. Allah says that in the Quran. Allah says inil hukmu illa lillah. Right? Allah says you won't believe فلا وربك لا يؤمنون حتى يحكموك فيما شجر بينهم. That none of you believe until you make the Prophet ﷺ a judge between you, not until you all get together and decide what to do. So that's one very clear reason why we're not liberals, right? But I can't say that but I wouldn't say that to a liberal because they don't ascribe to those things, right? So for them, I need to show why their worldview is wrong from their own premises. We call it an eminent critique, a critique from within of a worldview from its own premises, and then I need to establish for them my worldview, right? 1, 2, 3, until I can establish for them the authority of the Quran. And there's obviously different ways of doing that. So anyway, that's a few different points, but that's what you basically do. You build a rapport, you see where she's coming from, try and show her why she's saying what she's saying, and then or show why it's wrong and show a different aspect of the discussion. Keep in mind always, most times, 99% of the time, you're not going to convince anyone of pretty much anything in one discussion. And even in multiple discussions, you're likely to maybe convince them of some points, but you're not going to get converts. That's not the point. However, the point is to do the best job that you can of conveying the message from an Islamic point of view, but also from their point of view, you'll leave them with something to think about in most cases. And if there's any sincerity over time, that will help them out to, if Allah was to come across. All right, let me look at some of these questions in the chat. Aisha is saying, would you blame liberalism on sentencing shifts in medieval Europe from punishments of the body to alternative prison methods like rehabilitation? That's one aspect of changes that took place in modernity. Foucault looks at a lot of this stuff. I'm assuming this is the background of where you're coming from. But I wouldn't blame liberalism just on that. Like that's one aspect. You couldn't blame it for any one aspect. We can talk about more or less significant aspects, sure, but I think it's better to first outline or identify the different major aspects, and then we can talk about what's more or less significant, right? But what you're talking about, the move from corporal punishments to rehabilitation and prison, is one sort of shift in modernity. And it is, I would say, it's part of the secular web of movements or shifts in modernity, going from a different way of doing things. But that's a good example of the type of thing sometimes that Islam and other ways of life are criticized for, where people just don't understand it's a different way of doing things, right? So a common criticism would be, a common liberal criticism is like, oh, you guys still support capital punishment, and somehow that's backward and barbaric, right? But this is where work from people like Foucault helps, because it shows that these are just different ways of law and punishment and dealing with crime that different worldviews have come to, right? There's no intrinsic right or wrong. There's no intrinsic this is better than that. Why would you say capital punishment is any worse than 25-year jail sentence? Like, what objective grounds can you say that, right? And again, that leads into the other points that we've spoken about today. Another comment or question here. What are your thoughts on the argument that we are supposedly capable of self-government and of creating and enforcing our own laws and executing justice, so we have no need for divine laws or religion? And then something else. Okay, so let's take that one at a time. So again, that's a common claim that liberals will make. Others will make that as well. Socialists, for example. that we're capable of self-government and enforcing our own laws. But the thing is, propositions like that are just claims. The real discussion comes when you ask them to substantiate the claim, right? And more so to clarify their criteria of judgment. How do you come to judge whether we are capable or not? A lot of the times it's just it's like a feel-good thing. It's like, oh my God, you're saying we're not capable. You're saying human beings are not capable. Oh, you're treating us like kids, right? To characterize the criticism. It's like the ego was hurt because we're suggesting that human beings might not be capable of certain things, right? So so that type of a discussion, the way I would take it is to try and move it towards, again, explicating the assumptions and the presuppositions and the criteria of judgment. How are you deciding whether we're capable or not, right? And then you have that discussion. So from even just a rational perspective, right? I can agree. Let's take anything, right? Let's take homosexuality or as a practice. I might agree with someone. Let's say for argument's sake, I agree with a consequentialist or a utilitarian. I say, okay, look, let's use your criteria just as an argument to try and clarify some other points. Let's say we're going to say that X is immoral if it's more beneficial than harmful. Fine. Let's look at homosexuality as a practice now. In order to answer the question of what are the harms and benefits, and then to weigh them up, we're going to have to identify the harms and benefits. And I would argue that as human beings, we can't even identify the harms and benefits. Why do I say that? First of all, there's going to be so many different aspects. The effect of the practice on the human body, the effect of the practice on the intersubjective effect between people, right? On the relationship between the two people, on the relationship, on the familiar relationship, on the change of the family dynamic, the effect on the children, right? The long-term effect on the society, right? And so on and so forth. Now, you pick any one of those, and it's almost impossible to identify, let alone weigh up the harms and benefits. Take the human body. It's the first one. What is the effect? And I'm just using homosexuality as an example. You could say for the opposite. You could say for heterosexuality. If we said, are we going to allow heterosexuality in our ideal society or not? Right? Or should we continue to allow it or not? Right? Even determining the effects on the human body, you can't do that. Why can't you do that? Because even till today, our total sum human knowledge, our medical knowledge of the human body is deficient. And medical doctors will tell you that, right? Biologists will tell you that. We don't know. We know about the human body to a certain extent, and that's it. And we are continuously learning more. Right? The same is true about the physical world. The same is true about the chemical world. The same is true about the biological world, or the way in which we moderns divide the different aspects of life in the world. Right? So as a function of the limitation of our knowledge, we're not even able to identify the harms and benefits, forget putting them all together and then adding them, minusing them where they're different, they won't correspond, and then weighing them up. How are you going to do that? Right? So that's one example of how I can say, even by your criteria, here's the limitation. We can't do it. Right? And in the end, we're really guessing. And then they may still come back and say, okay, that's true, but we do our best and we change. We don't have to be fixed. We can learn more and do more. But each argument has to be looked at on its own merits, and that's one way of showing why we're not capable of self-government. Vis-a-vis that. Now, the other very important point is this whole discussion is not just about what we might be capable of not. It's also fundamentally attached to what is the reality, right? Does God exist or not, right? Like, if God exists, and if God being by definition all-knowing, all-wise, all-powerful, if God exists and if he determines X, whatever X is, to be moral, which rational person will say otherwise? Which rational person will say, no, I'm going to go with my own limited judgment? You wouldn't, right? It would be irrational to do so. So what that shows us is the actual difference is not in these other things. These are like surface level confusions about are we capable, are we not capable. They don't believe, either they don't believe in God, or they've come to accept a very secular understanding of the world and of politics. Therefore, it's private and we decide our public matters. It's one of the two. And therefore, that's where the discussion also has to be had. And I would suggest that most people would accept that form of an argument. If God exists and God says X, we would affirm X. Most rational people will accept that. What that shows, therefore, is doesn't matter what X is. And therefore, we don't need to waste time talking about this issue and that issue, and why you do this, and why do the women wear the hijab, and why do you worship like this, and why do you pray like that, and why do you have capital punishment, and why do you say this about apostasy, and because the issues are numerous, right? But if you focus on the fundamentals, I think that's a more beneficial and productive approach. Obviously, however, it's horses for courses. It depends on what the person's saying, where they're coming from, and what their background is as well. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up now. Just last couple of comments I want to read here. She was an atheist. She was of the belief that humans are inherently good in the state of nature. We approached the conversation from a philosophy perspective. Okay, that's good. Again, so this will depend on what you know and what the person knows as well. So if they believe humans are inherently good in the state of nature, the state of nature is a theoretical state that philosophers in early modernity posited. Doesn't mean it's a fictional. It's a fictional construct. But anyway, the point is just to show. So she's basically saying that humans, the fitrah of humans is good, which we would agree with from an Islamic perspective. Different approach, but we would agree that humans are generally good. But there's a difference between saying humans are good and the question that I would ask her, which is, what does it mean for us to do good for good's sake? That's the question in the conversation that I would have with her. Apart from, if she knows philosophy, and she also knows that the theorizations of the state of nature differ significantly amongst philosophers. And just as some people have come to show that we're good based on state of nature, others have done the exact opposite, right? Also here, Hajar is saying, we approached this question of homosexuality in a class on morality, and the professor, an atheist, argued that the act itself cannot be made immoral by the consequences. Okay, well that depends. Does he mean that we don't have enough information to make the judgment, or does he mean it should not be made on that basis? Anyway, I think we'll stop here. That just shows that particular points have to just be understood. It's always good also to ask people to clarify, let people talk, be good listeners. But anyway, I don't want to make this into a basic dawah workshop. We'll stop there, inshallah. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Big thank you, Jazakallah khair. Yeah, basically what Brother Uthman said, like the best way probably is to approach from the fundamental point of view, like show why they're wrong and then show, does God exist? So with that in mind, next week we're having a whole online class on how the Quran is divinely preserved, historically and spiritually as well. And also we're going to have a few classes on Sharia law. Is it barbaric? Is the hudud barbaric? It's basically going to touch on what Brother Uthman also said throughout his lecture. So yeah, just stay tuned. So see you tomorrow, next week's class, inshallah. And big thank you again, Jazakallah khair, for shedding a light on such an important topic. That's a fun with
Jazakallah khair for the MSA for organizing what it was a good initiative, and may Allah put benefit and tawfiq and accept it in your balance and their judgment, inshallah, on all our balances. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Bye.